She was once beautiful beyond mortal comprehension, with hair that flowed like golden silk and eyes that captured the hearts of gods and men alike. But one terrible act of violation transformed her into the most feared monster in Greek mythology, a creature whose very gaze could turn living flesh to stone. This is the story of Medusa, the Gorgon whose tale reveals the cruelest ironies of divine punishment and the tragic fate of a victim who became a monster. In the earliest days of Greek mythology, when gods still walked frequently among mortals and the line between divine and human realms was thin as morning mist, there lived three sisters known as the Gorgons. Their names were Stheno, Euryale, and Medusa, daughters born to the ancient sea deities Phorcys and Ceto, whose bloodline stretched back to the primordial powers that existed before the Olympian gods claimed dominion over the cosmos. But unlike her sisters, who were born as immortal monsters with brass hands, sharp fangs, and wings of gold, Medusa entered the world as something altogether different. She was mortal, beautiful, and entirely human in appearance, possessing a loveliness that set her apart not just from her monstrous siblings, but from nearly all other women who walked the earth. Her beauty was not merely physical, but radiant, the kind of transcendent attractiveness that seemed to emanate from her very soul. Medusa's hair was her most celebrated feature, cascading in waves of lustrous beauty that caught the light like spun gold. Men would stop in the streets simply to watch her pass, while women regarded her with a mixture of admiration and envy. But Medusa, aware of the power her beauty held, chose to dedicate herself not to mortal marriage or worldly pursuits, but to the service of Athena, goddess of wisdom and warfare. She became a priestess in Athena's temple, one of the select few chosen to serve the virgin goddess with devotion and purity. This position required absolute chastity, as Athena demanded that her priestesses remain as untouched and pure as the goddess herself. Medusa took her vows seriously, finding in religious service a purpose that transcended the superficial attention her beauty attracted from mortal men. The temple of Athena stood as a sanctuary of wisdom and learning, where philosophers came to debate, scholars to study, and supplicants to seek divine guidance. Medusa thrived in this environment, her natural intelligence complementing her physical beauty and making her an exemplary servant of the goddess of wisdom. She spent her days tending the sacred flame, performing ritual purifications, and assisting those who came seeking Athena's favor. But Medusa's extraordinary beauty, rather than being a blessing, would ultimately become the source of her greatest tragedy. Her radiance caught the attention of Poseidon, god of the seas, and one of the most powerful deities in the Greek pantheon. The sea god, known for his tempestuous nature and insatiable appetites, became obsessed with possessing this beautiful mortal who had dedicated herself to his niece, Athena. Poseidon pursued Medusa relentlessly, his divine desire overriding any consideration of her wishes or her sacred vows. He appeared to her in dreams, manifested in the ocean spray when she walked near the shore, and sent messengers bearing gifts that she refused. But Medusa remained steadfast in her dedication to Athena and her vows of chastity. Rejecting the sea god's advances despite the dangers such rejection posed, the god's obsession grew with each refusal, transforming from desire into determination to possess what had been denied him. Poseidon, accustomed to having his way through either seduction or force, could not tolerate being refused by a mere mortal woman, no matter how beautiful or devoted to another deity she might be. His pride, wounded by her continued rejection, demanded satisfaction. One fateful day, as Medusa performed her duties in Athena's temple, Poseidon appeared before her in his full divine glory. The sacred space meant to be a sanctuary from the outside world, and especially from such violations, offered no protection against a god who had decided to take what he wanted. Despite Medusa's pleas and prayers to Athena for protection, Poseidon violated her on the temple floor, desecrating both the priestess and the sacred space she served. The assault was not just a personal violation, but a cosmic offense, a deliberate desecration of Athena's temple and a direct challenge to the goddess's authority. Poseidon knew exactly what he was doing, choosing this location specifically to assert his power and demonstrate that not even his niece's sacred spaces were beyond his reach. The act combined personal violation with divine politics, making Medusa a pawn in the eternal power struggles between Olympic deities. When Athena discovered what had occurred in her temple, her rage was immediate and terrible. But the goddess's fury, rather than targeting the perpetrator, who was her uncle and a fellow Olympian too powerful to challenge directly, fell instead upon the victim. In a display of the cruel logic that often governed divine justice, Athena held Medusa responsible for the desecration of her temple, choosing to ignore or disregard the fact that the priestess had been powerless to prevent the assault. The transformation that Athena inflicted upon Medusa was designed to ensure that no one would ever desire her again, that her beauty, which had attracted such unwanted attention, would become a weapon of horror rather than admiration. The goddess's punishment was thorough and devastating, stripping away every aspect of Medusa's former loveliness and replacing it with features designed to inspire terror and revulsion. Medusa's beautiful hair, that golden cascade that had been the envy of all who saw it, transformed into a writhing mass of living serpents. These were not ordinary snakes, but venomous vipers whose hissing created a constant symphony of menace, their scales gleaming with an oily sheen that reflected light in sickening patterns. They moved with independent will, striking at the air and each other, creating a crown of perpetual motion around her head. Her once lovely face became a mask of horror, with features that retained enough of their former structure to hint at the beauty that had been lost, while being twisted into something nightmarish. Her skin took on a greenish pallor, her teeth grew into tusks like those of a wild boar, and her tongue became forked and serpentine. But the most terrible change came to her eyes, those windows to the soul that had once captivated all who gazed into them. Athena cursed Medusa's eyes with a power that made them lethal weapons, capable of turning any living creature that met her gaze directly into solid stone. This was not a quick or painless transformation, but a spreading petrification that began wherever the victim's eyes locked with Medusa's, spreading through their body as they watched in horror, fully conscious until the stone reached their brain and ended their awareness forever. The curse extended beyond Medusa's physical transformation to encompass her entire existence. She was banished from human society, driven from the temple that had been her home, and cast out to the furthest edges of the known world. She found refuge in a desolate land beyond the realm of the Hesperides, in a place where the living feared to tread, and where she could exist without risking accidental contact with those who might meet her deadly gaze. Her sisters, Stheno and Euryale, though immortal and monstrous themselves, chose to accompany Medusa into exile. Despite their fearsome appearance, they possessed some measure of sisterly love, and could not abandon their transformed sibling to face her cursed existence alone. Together, the three Gorgons established their home in this remote wasteland, creating a lair that would become infamous throughout the Greek world. The land around the Gorgons' dwelling gradually filled with the petrified remains of those unlucky enough to encounter them: warriors seeking glory, travelers who lost their way, and adventurers hoping to prove their courage, all met the same fate. Their stone forms creating a grotesque garden of eternal suffering. Each statue served as both warning and testament to the Gorgon's terrible power, though Medusa's curse made her by far the most dangerous of the three sisters. As the years passed and the collection of stone victims grew, Medusa's reputation spread throughout Greece. She became the ultimate monster, the creature that mothers invoked to frighten misbehaving children, and that warriors referenced when speaking of impossible challenges. Her name became synonymous with horror and petrification. The original context of her transformation lost or ignored as she was reduced to a simple monster in the collective imagination. But Medusa's existence as a Gorgon was not merely that of a mindless beast. She retained her human consciousness, trapped within her monstrous form and forced to live with the constant awareness of what she had lost and why. Every person she turned to stone was a reminder of the beauty that had once been hers. Every terrified scream, an echo of the violation that had led to her transformation. Her existence was a living death, conscious suffering without end or hope of redemption. The hero Perseus would eventually be sent to kill Medusa as part of what was essentially a suicide mission designed to rid King Pleiades of the young man's inconvenient protection of his mother. The king, desiring Perseus's mother Dano for himself, demanded the hero bring him the head of Medusa as a wedding gift, fully expecting that Perseus would die in the attempt and leave Dano vulnerable to the king's advances. But Perseus, as the son of Zeus, received divine assistance that would make the impossible possible. The gods who helped him were motivated less by concern for his welfare than by their own. agendas, and the opportunity to obtain Medusa's head for their own purposes, Athena herself provided guidance, perhaps feeling some lingering connection to her former priestess, or simply wanting to ensure that her temple's desecration was finally avenged through Medusa's death. Athena gave Perseus her polished bronze shield, which could serve as a mirror, allowing him to view Medusa's reflection without meeting her deadly gaze directly. Hermes provided winged sandals that would allow the hero to fly, and an adamantine sickle sharp enough to cut through the Gorgon's neck. Hades contributed his helmet of invisibility, which would allow Perseus to escape from Medusa's immortal sisters after the deed was done. Armed with these divine gifts, and guided by nymphs who knew the Gorgon's location, Perseus made his way to the desolate land where Medusa dwelt. He found the three sisters asleep, surrounded by the petrified remains of their victims. Using Athena's shield as a mirror, Perseus was able to approach Medusa without meeting her gaze. Seeing only her reflection as he drew near with his blade ready, in a single swift stroke, Perseus severed Medusa's head from her body, ending her cursed existence with the same suddenness with which it had begun. But even in death, Medusa's power remained potent. Her head retained its ability to turn living creatures to stone, making it a weapon of immense power that Perseus would use multiple times in his subsequent adventures. The blood that dripped from her severed neck possessed miraculous properties, capable of both killing and healing, depending on which side of her body it came from. From Medusa's blood emerged two remarkable offspring whose conception had occurred during her violation by Poseidon. The winged horse Pegasus sprang forth, majestic and pure, untainted by the circumstances of his creation. Chrysaor, a giant wielding a golden sword, also emerged, destined to become the father of other mythological beings. The fact that Medusa had carried these divine offspring within her throughout her years as a Gorgon added another layer of tragedy to her story. Perseus presented Medusa's head to Athena, who mounted it on her aegis, the divine shield that she wore into battle. The Gorgon's face, terrible even in death, became a symbol of divine protection and a warning to Athena's enemies. The goddess thus claimed final ownership of her former priestess, transforming Medusa from victim to weapon, from woman to object, completing the process of dehumanization that had begun with Poseidon's assault. The myth of Medusa has been interpreted and reinterpreted countless times throughout history, with each era finding different meanings in her transformation and death. Ancient Greeks saw her as a straightforward monster whose defeat demonstrated heroic courage and divine favor. They wore images of her face, known as gorgonions, as protective amulets, believing that the monster who could turn others to stone might similarly petrify evil forces that threatened them. Medieval Christians interpreted Medusa as a symbol of sinful vanity, suggesting that her beauty had been a form of pride that warranted divine punishment. This interpretation conveniently ignored the assault that actually led to her transformation, instead blaming the victim for possessing the beauty that attracted unwanted attention. Such readings reflect the persistent human tendency to hold women responsible for the violence enacted upon them. Renaissance artists depicted Medusa with a fascination that mixed horror with sensuality, creating images that simultaneously repelled and attracted viewers. They emphasized the tragedy of her transformation, often portraying her face at the moment of death with an expression that mixed pain with relief, suggesting that Perseus's blade had provided merciful release from her cursed existence. Modern feminist interpretations have reclaimed Medusa as a symbol of justified female rage and the victim who becomes a survivor. Her ability to turn aggressors to stone has been reimagined as a metaphor for the power to defend oneself, to stop attackers literally in their tracks. Her snake hair has been reinterpreted not as a curse, but as a crown of serpents, symbols of wisdom and transformation, representing her evolution from victim to powerful being who can no longer be harmed. Psychologically, Medusa represents the shadow self, the parts of our nature that we find too horrible to acknowledge and so project onto others. Her petrifying gaze symbolizes the paralyzing effect of confronting truths we wish to avoid, the way that facing our deepest fears can leave us frozen and unable to act. She embodies the concept that those who are most wounded can become most dangerous, that victimization can transform into the capacity to harm others. The myth also explores themes of divine injustice, and the arbitrary nature of punishment in a world governed by capricious gods, Medusa's transformation illustrates how the powerful can shift blame to the powerless, how victims can be held responsible for crimes committed against them, and how suffering can compound suffering rather than leading to justice or healing. These themes remain painfully relevant in contemporary discussions of sexual assault and victim blaming. In popular culture, Medusa has become one of mythology's most recognizable figures. Her image appearing in everything from corporate logos to feminist art, her face adorns the Versace brand, symbolizing beauty that fascinates and immobilizes. Artists and writers continue to retell her story, often emphasizing the injustice of her punishment and imagining alternative endings where she finds agency rather than simply becoming a victim twice over. The enduring power of Medusa's myth lies in its brutal honesty about the nature of victimization and the failure of divine justice. It shows us a world where the innocent suffer, where the powerful escape consequences, and where beauty can become a curse rather than a blessing. Yet it also demonstrates resilience, as Medusa survives for years despite her transformation. And even in death, her power persists. Medusa's story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about whose stories we tell, whose suffering we acknowledge, and whose victimhood we validate. Her transformation from priestess to monster, from victim to villain, reflects patterns that persist in how society treats those who have suffered trauma. The fact that her violation is often omitted from retellings, reducing her simply to a monster that needed slaying, shows how easily victims can be erased from their own narratives. In the end, Medusa remains one of mythology's most tragic figures. A woman whose beauty brought her not love or happiness but violation and transformation into the very thing that others feared. Her serpent hair and petrifying gaze were not choices she made, but punishments inflicted upon her for daring to be beautiful in a world where powerful gods felt entitled to take what they desired. Her story endures because it speaks to the timeless reality of how victims are blamed, how trauma transforms us, and how those who suffer most are often demonized rather than helped.